about this man. So I think the setup for Harrison and his journey was really capped into the movie.
Remember when a man convicted of murdering his own wife walked away from a train wreck, jumped off a 225-foot dam, and spent 2 hours trying to convince a federal marshal of his innocence? A marshal whose entire personality was not caring whether he was innocent? That was The Fugitive, released by Warner Brothers in the summer of 1993. Director Andrew Davis took a 1960s TV series about a wrongfully convicted man on the run and turned it into one of the tightest, most relentless thrillers of the decade. Harrison Ford as Dr. Richard Kimble, a Chicago surgeon who had never run from anything in his life and suddenly had to be extremely good at it. Tommy Lee Jones as Deputy U.S. Marshal Sam Gerard, a man who will inform you calmly that your innocence is not his department. Joe Pantoliano as Cosmo Renfro, the deputy with an opinion on everything. Cella Ward as Helen Kimble, gone before the title card finishes fading, and the entire reason the other 2 hours happen. And then there's, and apologies for the pronunciation, Héron Crabbe as Dr. Charles Nichols, the kind of old friend you should probably have worried about sooner. Today, we're counting down 15 weird facts about The Fugitive, and stick around for number 1 because the story behind I Don't Care is not the one you've been told. Now, before we begin, hit that like button and subscribe. Gerard doesn't care whether you're innocent or not. He definitely doesn't care whether you've subscribed, so do it anyway. Now, let's get into the countdown with number 15. Kevin Costner passed on this movie and made a flop instead. Before Harrison Ford ever touched this script, Kevin Costner was first in line for Richard Kimble. He was circling it as its star and reportedly as a possible director too. Then, he walks away. Costner passes on a $44 million thriller. The Western he made next cost $63 million, and by the time it opened, a rival movie about the same lawman had been in theaters for 6 months. That was Tombstone, made for a third of the money. Wyatt Earp made $55.9 million worldwide. The movie he passed on made $368.9 million. Basically an 8-to-1 return he handed to someone else. Costner said since that he loved making Wyatt Earp. Once Costner bailed, the hunt for Kimble turned into a free-for-all. Nick Nolte passed, citing his age, despite being roughly a year older than Ford, so not much of an excuse. Michael Douglas, Andy Garcia, Dennis Quaid, and Mel Gibson all circled it. Alec Baldwin was actually cast, then dropped out over money, and producer Arnold Koplinson said later that the studio wasn't sure Baldwin could open a picture that expensive anyway. Producer Keith Barish has said Tom Cruise as a heart surgeon would have turned the whole thing into a Tom Cruise movie, and Mel Gibson would have made it feel like Lethal Weapon with a stethoscope. Gerard, meanwhile, took about 30 seconds to cast. Andrew Davis had just finished Under Siege, where Tommy Lee Jones was on screen more than Steven Seagal was, and he says he knew immediately Jones would be perfect. Gene Hackman and Jon Voight were both considered as well. One role burned through a dozen actors and a star who signed and then walked. The other one took one director about one sentence. Guess which one won the Oscar? Number 14, The Fugitive filmed its biggest chase in a real parade. Chicago's actual St. Patrick's Day parade happened to be running the exact week they were shooting the City Hall chase, so Andrew Davis, a Chicago native, didn't bother building a fake crowd. He sent Harrison Ford and Tommy Lee Jones straight into the real one. No rehearsal, just Steadicam operator Steve St. John sprinting to keep pace with two movie stars weaving through parade goers who had no idea what had just wandered into their afternoon. Even the bit where Kimble grabs a hat out of a garbage can looks improvised because it basically was. Davis has said Ford just grabbed it mid-take on instinct. And the low profile worked on the real crowd as well. Ford is playing a man keeping his head down in public, so Ford kept his head down in public, and by his own account, he lasted several minutes out there before anybody recognized him. A wanted man vanishing into a parade played by a movie star doing the same thing by accident. None of this was in the script. Davis's account is that he couldn't let Gerard give up the chase, so he had Kimble run into the parade and get lost in it. A city just happened to be having a parade, and two movie stars ran through the middle of it while Chicago found out live on camera that its afternoon had a plot twist. Number 13, two actors added their own details to the movie. In the shooting script, Joe Pantoliano's character is just Renfro. No first name. The marshals were written as a row of raincoats with last names, and a Warner Brothers executive asked Andrew Davis why Gerard needed a whole team at all instead of one sidekick. So Pantoliano handed himself a first name. He decided the guy was Cosmo and got the rest of the cast to start calling him that on camera until it stuck. That's how a name nobody wrote ended up in the finished film, in the sequel, and on his IMDb page. The second addition came from Daniel Roebuck, who plays Deputy Biggs. The marshals had a long walking shot to fill. Chicago really does dye its river green every St. Patrick's Day, and Roebuck started riffing. He came up with the line asking why, if they can dye the river green today, they can't dye it blue the other 364 days of the year. It wasn't scripted, and Roebuck has said it was pure improv and that he had to ask Davis afterward whether they'd even shot the Green River. Davis had, and they cut it in. And that wasn't unusual on this set. Pantoliano says every line down in the storm drain was made up, including Renfro's complaint that he just bought those shoes. Two of the most quoted moments in the movie were written by the men saying them about 4 seconds before they said them. Number 12, two actresses lost their biggest scenes for two completely different reasons. Julianne Moore is billed fourth in this movie despite appearing for only a few moments. Her character, Dr. Ann Eastman, was originally supposed to be much more important. Kimble was supposed to become romantically involved with her while he was on the run, including a scene where he would take refuge at her apartment and the two would shower together. Andrew Davis later said producer Peter McGregor Scott stopped the idea cold. Kimble was mourning his wife. He couldn't be running around with another woman, and Davis agreed and cut it on the spot. This happened 3 days into shooting. Davis's account is that they phoned Arnold Copelson and told him to break it to Julianne that the scenes were gone. She was not happy about it. Davis has been careful to say it had nothing to do with her work. Cella Ward lost her material in the editing room months later. Editor Dennis Verkler pulled the murder out of the original opening and broke it into black and white flashbacks running under the main titles. Instead of one long block of exposition, Helen comes back in pieces all the way through the film. Editor Don Brochu says Ward took the biggest hit of anyone in that change. Ward's own read is the opposite. She figures she ended up on screen more in flashbacks than she would have in the version that they originally shot. Number 11, The Fugitive put a fake tunnel on top of a real dam. The dam is real. The Chiowa Dam, 225 feet of hydroelectric concrete on the Little Tennessee River, the tallest overflow dam in the world when it went up in 1919. The tunnel, however, is fake. The crew built a fake section of storm drain, mounted it onto a flatbed truck, drove it onto the actual dam, and pivoted it into place, running real water through it to sell the shot before hauling the whole rig away like borrowed furniture. Harrison Ford genuinely stood at the edge of that structure 225 feet up. The corridor leading up to it was a completely different build, an elaborate set on a Chicago soundstage, one continuous space on screen assembled 2 states apart. For the wide shot of the actual jump, they skipped Ford entirely and threw 6 stunt dummies off the dam's edge, one after another, at around $12,000 apiece. Most of them came back in pieces. And what's even more mind-boggling is that some physicists have pointed out a real jump from that height into churning water could theoretically be survivable, since turbulence breaks up the surface tension that would otherwise make it feel like landing on concrete. Doesn't make it a good idea though. Just means the movie's most impossible looking leap of faith isn't quite the physics crime it looks like. Number 10, one take, one train, $1 million, 0 do-overs. The opening train and bus collision was built as a full practical effect on a section of the Great Smoky Mountains Railroad near Dillsboro, North Carolina. A special spur track was built for production and the locomotives had their engines removed. Reported costs run from around $1 million to $1.5 million. The number that actually matters isn't the price tag. It's that the whole thing could only happen once. A real train, a real stretch of track, a real bus prop, and no way to reset any of it if a camera jammed or an actor stood a half second out of position. So they put cameras in 16 positions around the site, 2 of them mounted on the train and 1 inside the bus. Most were run remotely. One ended up buried under 26 feet of dirt and took 8 hours to dig out. And it worked. When the footage played at an early test screening, the audience didn't settle down for over 2 minutes. According to editor Don Brochu, that's roughly the exact moment Warner Brothers stopped interfering with the final cut, having just watched what $1 million bought them. Nothing was ever cleared away either. The locomotives and the bus are still lying in the trees where they came to rest on private railway land, and a tourist excursion train carries people past the wreck to this day. Number 9, Joe Pantoliano refused to let Cosmo Renfro die. The script had Cosmo Renfro taking a steel beam to the head in the laundry room shootout hard enough to strongly imply that he's dead. Pantoliano didn't love his odds. He went to Andrew Davis and made his case. What if there's a sequel? Davis caved and said, fine, nobody's killing you. Ford, however, wasn't buying it. Davis remembers Ford pointing out that nothing survives a beam like that, so, on the actual shooting day with no CGI around to fudge an ambiguous outcome, Pantoliano solved it himself mid-take. After the beam connects, he starts moaning and shifting on the ground, entirely unscripted, purely to prove Renfro's still breathing. Davis calls cut. Ford walks over, looks down at him, and tells him again he should be dead. Pantoliano gives him the same line he gave Davis. But what if there's a sequel? Ford says there won't be one because he won't be in it. Pantoliano tells him that's fine, they'll go find another $20 million movie star to chase through the woods. Ford cracks up, and Daniel Roebuck remembers Pantoliano yelling that there had better be a shot of him alive at the end of the movie, and there is one. Renfro is on a stretcher, breathing for no reason except that one actor refused to die on a technicality. Pantoliano had been fighting for Renfro's screen time throughout the production too, sticking close to Tommy Lee Jones and improvising lines to keep himself in the action. 5 years later, Cosmo Renfro was back in U.S. Marshals. Number 8. Harrison Ford refused surgery so the injury would stay in the movie. Early in production, while filming running footage in the North Carolina woods, Harrison Ford damaged ligaments in his leg. He didn't get it treated. Ford turned down surgery until filming was finished months later because the injury handed Kimble a limp he wanted to keep. Andrew Davis says Ford was on medication the rest of the shoot and really was hurting. From that point on, every scene where Kimble is running, that limp is a genuine ongoing injury. The injury fits the character with slightly uncomfortable precision. Kimble is a surgeon, someone whose entire identity runs on physical control, dropped into a situation that demands running, hiding, and getting hurt with zero training for any of it. A star with Ford's resources could have called for a body double and had the ligament fixed that afternoon. Instead, he ran an entire movie on a damaged leg, painkillers, and for months, because a limp he didn't have to act was better than one he had to. Okay, we're halfway through and we're going to take a quick pause. Kimble or Gerard? Whose side are you actually on? Drop it below, and if you said Gerard, buckle up because the next fact does not make that easier. Like and subscribe if you're enjoying this one. It helps YouTube find more people who still yell, "I didn't kill my wife," at nothing in particular. Okay, let's get back to the storm drain with number 7. Tommy Lee Jones refused to shoot Kimble in a crowd. Let's go back to that City Hall chase for a second. Before Kimble gets out into the parade, the script has Gerard firing at him inside the building with civilians everywhere. Tommy Lee Jones refused to play it. Not a performance objection, a believability one. He didn't think any law officer would start putting rounds from a .45 into a crowd of people. It escalated far enough that Jones wouldn't come out of his trailer. The producer told him it was a movie. Ford told him he had to do it. Davis says he was caught between an actor with an ethical objection and a picture that needed the shot. And screenwriter Jeb Stuart, who was simultaneously trying to finish the film's still unwritten ending back at his hotel, got pulled in to talk him down. Stewart's argument went straight at what the audience had just watched. Less than 5 minutes earlier in the cut, Gerard had killed Copeland, the other escaped prisoner, shooting him at point-blank range during a raid while Copeland held a deputy hostage. Copeland was black. Kimble is a wealthy white doctor. Stuart asked Jones how it was going to look that Gerard wouldn't even draw his weapon for the second man. Stuart didn't wait for an answer. He lost patience, got in a cab, and went back to the hotel. Producer Arnold Copelson called him later that day. Stuart asked whether Jones had drawn the gun at all. He had. Gerard pulled it and fired and fired and fired until they didn't have enough blanks left to keep going. Number 6. 9 writers, 5 years, more than 24 scripts. According to producer Arnold Copelson, the screenplay took 5 years, 9 writers, and at least 24 drafts before the version that reached cameras. Copelson had been chasing a Fugitive movie on and off since the 1970s. Some of the discarded versions are genuinely unhinged. Andrew Davis has called one early draft outright ridiculous. In it, Gerard himself secretly hires the one-armed man Kimble spends the whole movie chasing over an operation Kimble had botched. That version makes the marshal hunting Kimble the man who framed him. Screenwriter David Toohey wrote another version reframing the whole story as a modern Les Miserables, Kimble as Valjean, Gerard as Javert, and this is actually the draft that introduces the train and bus collision, the prison visit to a one-armed convict, and an early version of the waterfall jump, originally written for Niagara Falls before it became the dam. Its villain was a coal baron who also happened to be Kimble's father-in-law. The one-armed man had lost the arm in a collapse at the old man's mine and killed Kimble's wife to settle the debt. On top of that, Kimble was having an affair with his dead wife's sister and learning from her that their father had abused them both as girls. Toohey says Copelson's objection was that abusive fathers had stopped shocking anybody at the movies. That draft died there. Jeb Stuart, the writer, not the Civil War general, restructured everything around Kimble actively hunting the truth in Chicago instead of just running from it. Davis, once hired, added the pharmaceutical conspiracy backbone that finally gave the movie an actual villain worth chasing. The lean thriller that hit theaters is basically the last one standing after 24 weirder movies went in the trash. One of them had the hero's own pursuer running the frame up. Somebody made the right call on that one. Number 5, they shot the beginning before anyone knew the ending. Warner Brothers locked the release date before shooting even started, driven by Harrison Ford's limited availability, and made it very clear the date wasn't moving, script or no script. They shot it almost entirely in story order, which practically nobody does. It began in North Carolina with the train crash, moved to the Chihuahua Dam, and finished in Chicago in the spring. There still wasn't a finished script when it started. There definitely wasn't a finished ending either. Jeb Stuart spent the shoot splitting time between the editing rooms, the set, and a locked room at Chicago's Four Seasons. Andrew Davis says he and Ford and Tommy Lee Jones basically wrote the dialogue between them, with Stuart's pages arriving and getting reworked on the floor. Jones remembers it differently and bristles at the word improvisation. The lines might have been written that morning in somebody's trailer, but somebody wrote them. Then, with a Saturday production meeting looming and still no third act written, Stuart worked late into Friday night without getting anywhere, genuinely prepared to walk in and admit the movie had no ending. He said he feared that admitting they had no ending could actually shut the movie down. He turned the light off around 2 a.m., and 5 minutes later, by his own account, he turned it back on with the entire ending clear in his head and wrote it in one sitting. Part of it traced back to Joe Pantoliano, who'd been in the hotel pool one night, looked up at the skylight above it, and suggested the bad guy go through one. A movie already in production had no idea how it ended, and it found out with about a Saturday to spare. Number 4, 8 weeks to cut a movie that started at 3 hours and 10 minutes. Once photography wrapped, the entire editorial team moved on to a small studio lot in Hollywood, and as editor Don Brochu tells it, got shut in like a jury that wasn't allowed to go home. 6 editors, 10 assistants, and 6 production assistants. 6 days a week, 12 to 18 hours a day to deliver a finished cut in about 8 weeks. A typical schedule for a film that size was 6 months. The first assembled cut ran 3 hours and 10 minutes with a serious problem baked in from all that scriptless chaos on the ground. Kimble didn't become a fugitive until roughly 30 minutes into his own Fugitive movie. Brochu describes that opening as a day in the life of Kimble that just went on forever. A fashion show, an emergency surgery, home to find somebody already in the house, then a full courtroom trial. Meanwhile, James Newton Howard was scoring the picture under the exact same deadline, folding Wayne Shorter's saxophone into an orchestral score. Director Andrew Davis says other productions were still using it as a temp track 10 years later. Number 3, the first Dr. Nichols never got to finish the movie. Richard Jordan was originally cast as pharmaceutical executive Dr. Charles Nichols, this movie's actual villain, and had already shot scenes with both Harrison Ford and Tommy Lee Jones. In the spring of 1993, mid-production, he fell ill. It was a brain tumor and he had to withdraw. The climax, a full confrontation across the Chicago Hilton, hadn't been shot yet. The production needed a replacement immediately. Aaron Krabbe got a call from his agent in the middle of the night at home in Holland, told to be on a plane in Chicago by morning. He arrived knowing almost nothing about the movie and was immediately thrown into scenes with Harrison Ford. Because Jordan's earlier scenes already existed on film, the production had to reshoot them from scratch with Krabbe. That meant gluing a fake beard onto Ford, hours at a time in the makeup chair, to match footage shot earlier around a completely different actor. Look closely at Nichols' scenes before the hotel finale and the beard reads subtly wrong compared to the rest of the movie. A small permanent fingerprint of an emergency recast hiding in plain sight. Krabbe says he did about 95% of the Hilton fight himself, everything except the fall down the stairs outside, which insurance wouldn't let him near. Richard Jordan died on August 30th, 1993, just over 3 weeks after The Fugitive hit theaters. He was 56. Number 2, one real murder case looks almost exactly like The Fugitive. In the early hours of July 4th, 1954, Marilyn Sheppard was beaten to death in the bedroom of her family's home in Bay Village, Ohio. Her husband, Dr. Sam Sheppard, told police he'd been asleep downstairs, woken by screams, and knocked unconscious, chasing a bushy-haired intruder toward the lake. Investigators found no clear forced entry, learned Sheppard was having an affair, and the case turned into one of the most publicized trials in American history, with newspapers branding him guilty before the verdict landed. He was convicted and sentenced to life. He served 10 years. A young attorney named F. Lee Bailey, who would later represent Patty Hearst and O.J. Simpson, took up the appeal and won a landmark Supreme Court ruling in 1966 that the press circus had denied Sheppard a fair trial. Retried that same year under strict controls on reporters, he was acquitted. A doctor, a murdered wife, a mysterious intruder, a case built on suspicion instead of proof. It's been assumed for decades this is where the whole story comes from. Roy Huggins, who created the 1963 Fugitive TV series, spent 30 years denying it. His version is that the show started as an idea about Western heroes and drifters, updated for a 1960s audience. The hero became a fugitive from a capital crime because that was the most dramatic thing a man could be running from. He said he wasn't even aware of the Sheppard case when he came up with it in 1960. Two people disagree, and one of them was in the room. Daniel Melnick, the ABC executive who took Huggins' idea to the network president, told the Los Angeles Times in 1993, quote, "Roy's inspiration was the Sam Sheppard case," end quote. Sheppard's own lawyer, F. Lee Bailey, told the same paper there had never been any doubt in anyone's mind that Kimble came out of the Sheppard case. Huggins said no, Bailey said absolutely, Melnick said absolutely. Nobody has produced anything that settles it. So the strangest part of the story isn't whether Richard Kimble is Sam Sheppard with a rewrite, it's that the man who invented Kimble spent the rest of his life insisting he wasn't. Number 1, Tommy Lee Jones fought the fugitive's most famous line. Ask most people where "I don't care" came from, and they'll tell you Tommy Lee Jones made it up on the spot during a freezing night shoot in a storm drain. One more brick in the myth that this cast basically wrote the movie themselves. Good story. Also, nearly backwards. The words were already in the script. Jones just didn't want to say them. He spent a real stretch of that freezing, soaked through shoot trying alternate deliveries. His objection, as Stuart remembers it, was simply that the line didn't work. And this is the emotional hinge of the entire film. The exact second the audience understands Gerard genuinely does not care if Kimble's innocent, only that catching him is the job. After Jones had tried several alternatives, screenwriter Jeb Stuart finally said, "Why don't you just try I don't care?" He did. Andrew Davis called it immediately and moved the crew on. The myth doesn't stop there, and this next part is a genuine unresolved argument. The Marshal's other famous set piece, the hard target search briefing, already existed in a script draft David Twohy wrote back in February of 1992. The line about checking every henhouse, doghouse, and outhouse is right there on the page months before a single camera rolled, except Andrew Davis remembers it differently. He said flatly that the most quoted stretch of that speech was written by the marketing people for the trailer, and Daniel Roebuck, who plays Deputy Biggs, confirms the mechanics. Jones shot the monologue twice, once for the movie with the Marshals in frame, and once for the trailer without them, and the finished film cuts between the two. Watch it closely and people are standing in the wrong places. Twohy has his dated script pages. Davis has his own memory of how it happened. 30 years later, the credited screenwriter and the director still don't agree on who wrote the second most famous line in the movie. The movie everyone calls the one the cast just made up turns out to be a lot more written than people give it credit for. On its two famous lines anyway. And there you have it, 15 weird facts about The Fugitive. Which one got you? Drop it in the comments section below. Subscribe because Gerard doesn't care whether you're innocent, but we care whether you hit that button. Also, send this to whoever still swears they'd have made a better fugitive than Harrison Ford. They wouldn't have. Until next time, this is Remember When.